So today I'm going to teach you the dangers of being way too nice to your tenants, and yet also teach you how to treat them fairly but not get walked all over at the same time. So this is actually a very frequent problem in this city, and as a property manager of over 20 tenants, I definitely have a lot of experience working with different tenants and also working even with my partners whom combined own another 100 units. So definitely a lot to be said here. So let's go ahead and break it down. So most of you as new landlords are going to think, okay, the nicer that you are to your tenants, the more likely they're going to be nicer to you, right? Like, do nice for fellow man and they'll do nice back. Well, unfortunately, this isn't really how it ends up working in many situations. Yes, you should absolutely fix maintenance problems and actual legitimate maintenance problems, and your tenants will respect you for it. But you, at the same time, need to be very careful about what you also decide to fix if it's not a major expense or a major repair, or even if it's just little tiny requests that the tenant might make. These might seem insignificant and harmless to you, but they can really come back to bite you over the course of the relationship with your tenant. This is especially true if you're a very agreeable person. Agreeable people tend to do more for others than they really do for themselves, and I actually tend to fall into this category a little bit as well. But unfortunately, by being this type of person, you can become easily exploited. You might find that in your daily life, maybe at work or even with relationships. Well, this works in the same way with your relationship with your tenant. If you do too much for them, if you are constantly always saying yes, if you're constantly always there for them, you're going to find you're going to get exploited as well. So let's go into a few things, starting from when we first meet the tenant in the beginning and all the way till like emergencies and major expenditures, or maybe even the small things. Let's go ahead and break it all down and how I would address these situations. So before we get into it, let me know in the comments section below if you have ever been really nice to a tenant and then they were just the most needy person ever, constantly asking for thing after thing and never being satisfied with everything that you do. If you have this kind of experience and you know what it's like, then comment below, let me know. I actually want to hear your stories. I can use those in future videos and as examples of what exactly I'm talking about. When I talk about all of this, we're going to assume three things. Number one is that you're self-managing the properties. Obviously, if you have a property management company, then you really don't have to worry about half of these items since you're not the one really interacting with the tenant. However, it is very encouraged to be a property manager at least for a little while before you hire a property management company, so that way you know kind of what you're doing and what to ask for. The other assumption is that you are not renting to family and friends. This is a huge no. I would absolutely not recommend renting to family and friends. You're going to have a hard time enforcing restrictions and rules on them. You might even strain your relationship with someone who's important to you. So I wouldn't take the chance. I would just simply say, oh, I don't really have anything available anytime a family or friend asks. And this, of course, is doubly true with your actual tenants. Don't become friends with your tenants. Remember, this is a business, so if you didn't know them before, that doesn't mean you now should start going out and partying with them and going all over the place. You should treat that strictly as business, so that, of course. And then the third thing, we have to assume that you know the law. There's no quicker way to make a tenant disrespect you or not respect you than for you to not seem like you know what you're doing. You really want to make sure that you have a firm grasp on fair housing laws, the area, different things and regulations. If you're a new landlord, this might come across as a little bit tricky, but essentially you can get around this by saying, oh, let me follow up with you on that. Oh, I think it might be this way, and let me check the specifics of that code and everything. So try not to sound like an expert if you really aren't one. But this all being said, you definitely want to sound at least like you have the respect of someone who knows what they're doing. So let's go into the first point. So I have one of my partners where he moved someone into the house, and he told her before she moved into the house that he would clean up the property for her and make sure everything was all squared away. And they pretty much left it at that. Well, she got got in the house and then suddenly blew up his phone with all sorts of requests and demands, saying the house was not clean at all. She was really, really upset. Now, of course, before this person moved into the house and before she signed the lease, she was the sweetest person ever. But after that, she became just someone who absolutely needed everything done. I mean, if it could be done, it needed to be done. If it was a tiny hole or anything, little tiny thing that would not even impact her on the property, she needed to have this done. And by just simply following a couple rules before the move-in on how we talk to our tenants, then he could have avoided this problem entirely. First off, when a tenant asks you to do something, or asks, maybe they're moving into the house and saying, oh, are you going to clean up the place? Be very specific about what it is you're going to clean up. Don't just say you're going to clean the house. Say you're going to clean literally this and this. Maybe you're going to mop the floors because you know there's footprints through all the turnover traffic, and you're going to clean the stove or trim the yard one time. Make it very clear you're not going to do anything else. If they don't want the house exactly as is after you've mopped the floor and trimmed the yard, or maybe one other thing, then they shouldn't take it. So you need to be very clear on these type of things. Now, a lot of times they might get a little annoyed with you about, all the things you're not going to do. And this can easily be because it's part of your policy. You as a landlord don't have to say you're the owner. A landlord is also a property management agent, which means you can be the property manager even if you own the house. I would strongly recommend being the property manager, not the owner of the house. That way you can always shift things onto the owner. This also allows you to not have to make decisions immediately when you're talking about, okay, what needs to be done. It gives you a little bit of wiggle room. You can say, oh, I'll talk to the owner about that. I think that's a great idea. Now, keep in mind also one little note is that this allows you to agree with the tenant if you're the property manager and not the owner. See, if the owner agrees with the tenant, then that means they have an expectation that's going to be done. But if you as the property manager agree with the tenant, then you can agree, but then, at the same time, you couldn't do anything about it. The owner didn't approve the change. So you can easily give them a no and then yet be on their side, so that way the confrontation is not with you and the tenant. The tenant's frustration is on something you can't control at all. And if you can't control the situation, there'll be a lot less pushy for you to try to get it done. Now, I had another person on the channel reach out to me, and he wanted my advice on his own tenant situation where he was being really cordial about everything, trying to absolutely do everything this tenant wanted. And he noticed the more he did, the bigger the requests got. I actually had a situation like this myself where a tenant wanted a cat, and they already had a cat. So I was like, all right, no problem. Sure, you can have another cat. But then later on, they sent me a cute picture of a dog, and now they were asking for that too. You're going to find this repeatedly over and over again. Also, remember that your tenants are going to try to push the limits of what it is you have set in place as the rules. So understanding this, you need to know how to protect yourself. You can't simply say yes to every single thing. You need to know not to say yes, in fact, to most things. What's going to end up being created if you keep saying yes is what we call a yes ladder. A yes ladder is a persuasion technique where getting you to say yes to little small things early on can gradually build you up into saying yes to larger things down the road. Your tenants may not knowingly use this strategy, but it will have an effect as they notice every time they ask for something, you simply say yes. And this is where we get into the casual interactions of the video. So let's say they've already moved into the house, and they're now just asking for small things. Hey, a hornet's nest has, made a nest up there. Do you mind clearing it out for me? Well, guess what? If you say yes to that, you're always going to be clearing out the hornet's nest. Also, let's say maybe there's a hole in the wall that they just want filled. Not a reasonable sized hole, but maybe a tiny little hole in a pantry that you didn't notice. They just want you to caulk it up. Well, if you say yes to that, any hole they find going forward, you're going to be filling that hole. It goes with this for everything. If they think you have said yes to it before, then now it means yes going forward. So you need to be very careful about these real small interactions. Otherwise, while it might not be costly, maybe it's just a $5 can of, hornet spray, or maybe some caulking or something very simple, you'll find yourself up to your head in just requests and maintenance, and you'll be visiting this house more than your own home. So you need to absolutely make sure you limit the amount of requests to what is really necessary and what really is your job. Yes, it is your job to keep out rodents, but you can't possibly plug every single hole in some of these properties, especially if they're a lot older. This is especially true in Baltimore City, where in Baltimore City, these houses are so old that it would be very, very difficult for you to find every single gap that any spider can crawl into. Now, if you are going to give in on these small requests, remember to don't budge on anything unless you get something in return. Now, this usually works a little bit easier for a slightly larger thing than maybe filling a hornet's nest or something like that. But if they ask for something bigger, like one of my tenants asked me for an IKEA wardrobe, just wanted to have it. I mean, I kind of felt like the reason was realistically they were trying to move in a girlfriend and they wanted a second IKEA wardrobe for that person. But, I kind of thought about it, and rather than just simply saying yes because the cost would have been frivolous to me, instead, I asked for a lease renewal, and you can ask for maybe a lease extension or maybe a higher amount of rent. I know one of my mentors, Mark Owen, says, hey, look, I can do that for you, but it's going to bump your rent up $10 a month. Are you sure you want that? That's because the person was asking for things like a microwave or little other amenities. Once again, small items, but you want to get in the habit of asking for something in return. Now, I also had one of my partners feel obligated to kind of do these small things for the tenant because the tenant was doing small things for them, unasked, by the way. The tenant would go out of their way to maybe trim something or do something that really wasn't in the lease agreement just to make it more homely for themselves. You have to remember you don't owe your tenant anything just because they did some work for you, and especially when it was work you didn't ask for. I know one time my tenant had a towel bar that broke. It was not a towel bar, but a tension rod for a shower, and essentially it broke and needed to be replaced. Now I was going to replace it, but the tenant went ahead and replaced it anyway. I don't owe them for that cost. I was going to replace it with a much cheaper towel bar, but they went ahead and replaced it with a fancier version. I didn't need to replace it with that. So don't feel obligated. Don't feel you need to pay them for that. Otherwise, now going forward, your tenant can just replace everything and suddenly you'll be the one paying for it. And finally, on these small issues, these small casual interactions, you could just forget that the issue even happened in the first place. All you have to do is simply, as mentioned, say, oh, I'll ask the owner. And, they'll wait and wait and wait, and eventually they'll just kind of get used to exactly what it was as it is. So, for example, one of my tenants was asking for the head of a railing, essentially just one of the top of it closed. And with this, I essentially I talked to the owner, and getting the part for this would have been kind of annoying and everything. And you know what? We decided it was such a small issue, we're just going to let the tenant get used to it being exactly as it is. Otherwise, every single little thing about the house that wasn't exactly how it's supposed to be could be a potential future request. So I said, I'll ask the owner, and then 3 weeks later, promptly forgot about it, and it never got brought up again. So this is something you can do on those smaller requests. Remember, I'm not talking about maintenance items. I certainly would not use this strategy on an HVAC problem or an electrical issue or anything like that. So how do we handle those bigger interactions, the ones we can't just simply ignore, or maybe it's a more major maintenance request? Now, for some of the larger maintenance requests, you obviously don't want to ignore those, as I just mentioned, but what if your tenant is asking to do some of these repairs for you? Well, this gets a little bit tricky. Let's say they want to paint the house for you, or maybe they want to fix a fence that's annoying them and you don't have the money to take care of it right now. Well, in these situations, you have to also be careful, because if the tenant does the work for you, they may feel entitled to do all the rest of the work for you as well. So what I would do is this. If not forcing them to get a contractor with your approval that they recommend to you and then you approve that contractor later, instead ask them for a deposit. Simply state that, okay, the owner's fine with this. However, I need a deposit from you first of, let's say if they want to paint the house, I don't know, it's an apartment, $1,000. Well, if the owner likes the paintwork, then he'll give you that money back. But if he doesn't like the paintwork, then he's going to hold on to that deposit to make sure you paint the house back the way that it's supposed to be. This is how I would recommend addressing all requests that tenants ask to fix for themselves. Of course, I certainly wouldn't recommend this on HVAC systems or major things. However, let's say that your tenant happens to be a mechanic or an HVAC technician or some other electrician, plumber, whatever that deals with your house, or a handyman in general. In this case, I would highly recommend not hiring them for the duty, because if you have to enforce maybe they did it wrong or broke it even, then it's going to be a little bit more complicated, because now they live in your house and they might feel really annoyed and tense with you. So just let them know that you're not going to let them fix major repairs. I would not recommend it whatsoever. But if it's little cosmetic changes, or maybe, like I said, the fence post being, damaged, we don't really care if they, mess it up too much further, then okay, fine, I just need that deposit first. Now let's get into the big one, because a lot of people are going to run into a lot of emotional decisions that come up. And this is where the tenant feels really charged about a subject. And they might even be mad at you about the subject. So for instance, I had a tenant who got robbed, essentially robbed right outside of her house. And she was really upset, really irate, got a lot of personal belongings stolen, and essentially she asked me to install camera equipment around the house, essentially security features and such. Now, this really doesn't make any sense for me as the landlord. From a monetary aspect, you wouldn't want to start stringing up cameras around every single house and pay for the monitoring, the monthly fees in order to do all of that. It just really doesn't make financial sense, and realistically, this is something the tenant should deal with. However, in the moment, that tenant is probably really, really irate and irrational because the emotions have taken charge of them. So instead of immediately disagreeing with them, what I would recommend instead is to sympathize with them, or empathize with them realistically, and just agree with their situation. Just say you understand, that you get what they're going through, or well, I wouldn't really say I get what they're going through, but you understand what it is they are upset about. Okay, you understand why they're upset. Make sure you just agree with them. Say, all right, I'll tell the owner. Yes, the owner is you, but say you'll tell the owner. And, you're just going to address it with them. And what you want to do is try to space yourself out from the time when this initial incident happened to, when you have to make the decision. Just simply going to sleep on it will probably make the situation go away. And actually, that's how I handled it. Sort of my just forgot about it method. Essentially, you want to make it where you can get them to a point where they're being logical about it. And if they still don't forget, they don't forget at all, then that's when you can do the give and take method that I had mentioned earlier. Okay, I'll install this security camera for you, but we need to raise the rent by another $20 a month because we have to have a subscription service for this. So if you're agreeable to that, then we'll go ahead and install that. So this is something that you can do even if the subscription service is really only $15 a month and you're profiting $5, however you want to do that. I wouldn't recommend it necessarily in case the tenant finds out, but that is another way you can go around it. So I mean, realistically though, what I'm saying is you just need to empathize with them first. Don't combat the tenant on what it is you should and should not do for the house when they're really emotionally irate in that situation. Another really emotionally charged subject is emergencies. And emergencies can be their AC died in the summertime, or their heating died in the wintertime, and maybe they have an electrical outage, or maybe in a rooming house your internet suddenly cut out. These are all emergencies. And what you need to do is, of course, react quickly, yes. But let's say it's in the middle of midnight and this is when they call you. You have to understand that there's very little you can do at that moment. And they'll probably be fine, at least in the moment. Yet granted, if your house is flooding or under a riot, it's a totally different situation. But in these more normal circumstances, losing heat in the winter, for example, you're just going to do what you can. If the tenant calls on a Sunday, most places are closed on a Sunday and will charge you a lot of extra fees in order to come out on a Sunday. In fact, I know a lot of my contractors, they don't really work Sundays. So that can cause another issue where now suddenly an emergency pops up. In these scenarios, what you need to do is not stress out. The more times you go through these, the less you're going to feel really stressed by this situation. This is also true for evictions as well. You're going to feel more and more comfortable as you go forward. So just don't stress about it. Understand it will be resolved. Everything will be okay. And don't treat everything as an emergency, especially if it's really not an emergency, because then your tenant will think they can just call you at midnight for pretty much anything. So that's really it as far as how I would recommend you treat your tenants. Let me know if you have any questions regarding this video. Obviously, this whole business is a little bit difficult, especially for us who, all of you who are like me, who like to be as generous and kind to people as possible. It gets a little bit tricky. But for now, let me know if you had any questions about maybe a specific situation you have with a tenant. And maybe I'll make a video on exactly how I'll go through it. If not, absolutely, I'll just respond to your comment. So like and subscribe, leave a comment below, and I will talk to you all very soon.